Snow fell heavily outside the dark windows of the Miller house. It was Christmas Eve, a night usually filled with joy and loud music. However, this house was completely silent and very still. The thick white snow covered the front yard like a cold blanket. Inside the large dining room, a bright fire burned in the stone fireplace. The yellow flames danced and made soft cracking sounds in the quiet room. But the bright fire could not melt the deep coldness inside the house. The cold did not come from the terrible winter weather outside. The heavy cold came from a broken heart and a painful memory. It was a deep sadness that lived in every corner of the old house. Mr. and Mrs. Miller sat at the opposite ends of a long wooden table. They did not speak, and they did not look at each other. The large dining table was covered with a beautiful red cloth. There were tall white candles burning slowly in the center of the table. Plates of delicious roasted meat, warm bread, and sweet vegetables sat untouched. The wonderful smell of the hot food filled the air, but nobody was hungry. There was a very strict tradition in this quiet house. At the middle of the long table, there was one empty wooden chair. It was a beautiful chair with soft green fabric on the seat. No one ever sat in this chair on Christmas Eve. This empty chair belonged to their oldest son, Peter. Many years ago, Peter died in a terrible car accident during a winter storm. He was a kind young man with a bright smile and a warm heart. Since that tragic day, the house lost all its happy music and laughter. Every year, they prepared a plate of food for the empty space. They placed a shiny fork and a clean glass next to his plate. It was their way of remembering the boy they loved so much. But this tradition only brought them more pain and more bitter tears. Mr. Miller looked down at his rough, old hands. He remembered how Peter used to hold his hand when they walked in the park. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the sound of his son's voice. The silence in the dining room was heavy and difficult to breathe. Mrs. Miller wore a dark dress and a silver necklace. She stared at the flickering candlelight with empty, tired eyes. She missed her son's loud footsteps on the wooden stairs. She missed his warm hugs on cold winter mornings. The clock on the wall made a loud ticking sound. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Every second felt like a heavy stone dropping into a dark lake. The sadness in the room was a thick fog that covered everything. Suddenly, a loud sound broke the terrible silence of the dining room. It was a heavy knock at the thick wooden front door. Mr. Miller lifted his head and looked at his wife in pure shock. They were not expecting any visitors on this lonely night. The knock came again, louder and more urgent this time. Mr. Miller slowly pushed his chair back and stood up from the table. His old knees hurt as he walked slowly toward the front hallway. He wondered who could be outside in such a terrible snowstorm. He reached the front door and turned the cold metal lock. When he opened the heavy door, a freezing winter wind rushed inside. The cold wind blew snow onto the clean wooden floor of the hallway. Standing on the porch was a completely unexpected visitor. It was a young woman wrapped in a thin, wet coat. She was shivering from the extreme cold, and her face was very pale. Her dark hair was covered in white snowflakes, and her boots were dirty. She looked like a tired stranger who had traveled a very long distance. Despite her tired appearance, the young woman had very warm, kind eyes. She stood nervously under the yellow light of the front porch. In her frozen hands, she carefully held a small, unexpected object. It was an old doll made of faded cloth and worn yarn. Mr. Miller stared at the stranger with a confused look on his face. He did not know this girl, and he did not understand why she was here. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked in a low, rough voice. He wanted to close the door and return to his quiet sadness. The girl took a deep breath and looked up at his tired face. Her voice was shaking slightly from the freezing cold. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. "Is this the home of a young man named Peter?" Hearing that name was like a sudden shock to Mr. Miller's heart. He grabbed the edge of the door to keep his balance. His eyes grew wide, and his breath stopped in his throat. No stranger had spoken his son's name in this house for many years. Mrs. Miller heard the conversation and slowly walked into the hallway. She stood behind her husband, looking at the freezing girl on the porch. "Yes," Mrs. Miller whispered, her voice full of pain and confusion. "Peter was our son, but he passed away a long time ago." The young woman closed her eyes, and a single tear fell down her cold cheek. She nodded her head slowly, as if she already knew the tragic truth. "I know," she said quietly. "I have spent years trying to find his family." Mrs. Miller opened the door wider and looked at the freezing snow. "Please, come inside out of the cold," she told the young stranger. "You're freezing, and the wind is too strong tonight." The girl stepped into the warm hallway and gently brushed the snow off her coat. They led the young woman into the large, warm dining room. The bright fire was still burning, making the room feel cozy and safe. The girl looked at the beautiful table and the empty chair in the middle. She seemed to understand the deep sadness of the quiet house immediately. Mr. Miller pulled up a chair near the hot fireplace for her. She sat down carefully and held her cold hands near the bright flames. She still held the old doll tightly in her lap, like a precious treasure. The old couple stood near her, waiting silently for her to speak. After a few minutes, the girl's skin lost its pale, frozen color. She looked at Mr. and Mrs. Miller with deep gratitude in her eyes. "My name is Lily," she began in a soft, gentle voice. "I came here tonight to tell you a story about an angel." The old couple sat down on the sofa, listening very closely. Lily gently touched the worn fabric of the old doll in her lap. "10 years ago, I was a young orphan living on the dark city streets," she said. "I had no parents, no home, and absolutely no hope." She looked at the bright fire, lost in a painful memory. It was Christmas Eve, and the weather was just as cold as tonight. I was sitting in a dark alley, crying because I was freezing and hungry. People walked past me with expensive gifts, but nobody stopped to help. Lily took a deep breath and continued her emotional story. "I thought I was going to die in the snow that night. But then, a young man with a bright, kind smile stopped in front of me. He took off his warm winter scarf and wrapped it around my cold neck." Mrs. Miller gasped softly and covered her mouth with her hands. She remembered knitting that exact same scarf for Peter many years ago. "He bought me hot soup and sat with me in the cold alley," Lily said. "He talked to me like I was a real person, not just a dirty orphan." Lily lifted the old doll and showed it to the parents. Then he reached into his bag and gave me this beautiful gift. He told me he bought it for his little cousin, but he wanted me to have it. It was the first gift I ever received in my entire life. Tears began to gather in Mr. Miller's tired, old eyes. He could easily imagine his kind son doing such a wonderful thing. "I was crying so hard," Lily whispered, wiping her own eyes. But he wiped my tears away with his warm hand. She looked directly into Mrs. Miller's crying eyes. He smiled and told me, "Don't cry. My family always has enough love for everyone." Those simple words saved my life and healed my broken soul. Lily explained how Peter's kindness gave her the strength to survive. She went to an orphanage, worked very hard at school, and became a nurse. She wanted to help other people, just like Peter had helped her. She kept the old doll with her every single day as a reminder. "I tried to find him for years to say thank you," Lily explained. "When I finally found his name and address, I learned about the terrible accident. I am so sorry for your tragic loss. Your son was a true angel." The quiet house was no longer filled with a cold, empty silence. It was filled with the sound of Mrs. Miller crying softly. But these were not the bitter, painful tears of the past few years. These were warm, beautiful tears of pride and deep, healing love. Mr. Miller stood up and walked over to his crying wife. He wrapped his arms around her shoulders and held her very tightly. He finally felt a heavy weight lifting off his old, tired heart. His son was gone, but his beautiful spirit was still alive in the world. They realized that Peter had never really left them. His incredible kindness had grown and changed the life of this young woman. He was still living through her good actions and her gentle heart. The sad tradition of the empty chair suddenly felt wrong to them. Mr. Miller looked at Lily and gave her a warm, genuine smile. The deep sadness in his eyes was replaced by a bright light of hope. He walked over to the long dining table and looked at the empty place. He placed his hand on the wooden back of the green chair. For years, this empty chair was a painful symbol of death and loss. It was a constant reminder of the boy who would never come home. But tonight, the meaning of the chair completely changed in his heart. It was no longer a symbol of loss, but a symbol of welcome. Mr. Miller pulled the chair back from the table. He turned to the young woman sitting by the warm fireplace. "Lily," he said, his voice thick with strong emotion, "would you please do us the honor of joining us for dinner?" Lily looked at the empty chair and then at the old man. Her eyes filled with fresh tears as she understood his generous offer. She stood up slowly, holding the old doll against her chest. "I would love to," she whispered with a grateful, shaking voice. She walked over to the table and sat down in Peter's chair. Mrs. Miller quickly went to the kitchen to get another hot plate. She returned with a huge smile on her face, bringing more food to the table. The heavy, dark fog of sadness was finally pushed out of the room. They passed the warm plates of roasted meat and soft bread. They poured hot tea into clean glasses and shared the delicious food. For the first time in many years, the dining room was filled with happy sounds. Silver forks clinked against plates, and gentle laughter echoed off the walls. Lily placed the old doll carefully on the table near the candles. The bright light shined on the worn fabric, making it look beautiful and perfect. She told them wonderful stories about her job at the children's hospital. Mr. and Mrs. Miller listened with bright eyes and open hearts. They told Lily funny stories about Peter when he was a little boy. They talked about his messy room and his loud, terrible singing voice. They laughed until their stomachs hurt, remembering the joy he brought them. Talking about him no longer felt like touching a sharp, painful knife. They finally understood the true meaning of Peter's words in the cold alley. "My family always has enough love for everyone." He wanted them to share their love, not lock it away in the dark. The best way to remember him was to keep his kindness alive. The Christmas lights blinked outside the window, shining on the white snow. Inside, the fire burned brightly, keeping the large room perfectly warm. The three of them sat around the table, sharing a beautiful, peaceful moment. The pain of the past was gently washed away by this new connection. Lily looked around the bright room and felt a deep sense of peace. She had spent her whole life feeling like a lonely stranger. But sitting at this table, eating warm food with these kind people, everything changed. She finally felt like she had found a place where she could belong. Mr. Miller raised his glass of water into the air. To Peter, he said with a bright, proud smile on his face, "And to the beautiful love that he left behind for us." Mrs. Miller and Lily raised their glasses and repeated his words together. The house was no longer quiet, cold, or empty. It was filled with light, hope, and the wonderful sound of a new family. The empty chair was finally filled, and their broken hearts were finally healed. Peter's beautiful gift of love had finally found its way back home.